Next, from the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, with the nation marking the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, we take a look at one of the 5 copies of the address that President Lincoln wrote in his own hand. We'll also talk with a curator at the museum and hear why this speech mattered so much when it was delivered in November of 1863, and why it is considered by many as the best speech ever delivered by an American president. This runs about 15 minutes.
James Cornelius, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel. And as we are here at the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, you have a very special exhibit going on now that coincides with the 150th anniversary of Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. It is one of 5 of the original copies that Lincoln wrote in his own hand. Tell us a little bit about this copy and how it came to be in the possession of the museum.
Certainly, Terry. The 5 copies is certainly more than most you find of any historic document, but Lincoln was working on it over a period of several weeks, and then he was asked to make fresh copies for people after the event. The first 2 are not quite complete, or they look like they're compositional copies, and those were left behind with his secretaries in Washington. The copy that is here in Springfield, and has been since 1944, was made at the request of Edward Everett, who was the principal speaker that day in Gettysburg as the nation's greatest orator. And Everett was asked to put together his manuscript of the speech and the president's manuscript, as well as a few illustrations, battle maps, and photographs of generals, into a notebook that was sold for charity in New York City the next spring to aid wounded soldiers and their families. And that notebook then remained in private hands for exactly 80 years, as it happens, until the state of Illinois was able to acquire it from a New York manuscripts dealer. And the story behind that acquisition is a wonderful piece of civic life and wartime morale boosting, which is in fact what the president had gone up to Gettysburg himself to do, in part, in 1863. That is, to steel the nation's spirits for the war that would continue. Because in 1943, it was the idea of the trustees of the Presidential Library, as it's now called, the state's historical library, to acquire that notebook, the Everett manuscript and the Lincoln manuscript, using the pennies of the Illinois school children, that they were each asked to contribute to collect 5 Lincoln pennies, or 5 cents each, and send it to Springfield so that the money could be accumulated and paid to the New York manuscripts dealer instead of selling it to someone else, a private collector, for example. And this was a World War II era morale booster. And there was a special feature to this to make sure that it succeeded. Namely, Marshall Field III, who was much involved with historic commemoration and preservation at that time, said that if the school children of Illinois fell a little bit short for this high price, he would write a check for the difference. And Mr. Field did, in fact, write out a check for about $10,000 to supplement the $50,000 in change, small change, that the school children had gathered.
$50,000 in change.
$50,000 in small change. So $60,000 is what was paid in 1944, then when it came to Springfield, for both the Lincoln manuscript and the Everett manuscript, and a little supplement to that, because the same family who'd owned it for many of those years also had a letter by Robert Lincoln, written when he was Secretary of War in 1885, explaining to them, yes, that is my father's handwriting on your copy of the Gettysburg Address.
Well, you know, it used to be years ago that I think school children would memorize the Gettysburg Address, and you have some reproductions, some rare reproductions of how it was reprinted Shortly after the speech was delivered on newsprint and distributed, why did this speech capture the nation's attention even immediately after it was delivered, and why do we still feel that it resonates today?
It captured the people's imagination for a host of reasons. Anything that famous has a lot going for it. I think that the speech works on a simple level because it's short and most people can memorize it. It works on the level of biblical allusion as well as national reflection and a bow to the traditions of the Declaration of Independence and the importance of it. Certainly, it commemorates and consecrates in a lay fashion the effort of the soldiers who fought there, and many of whom died there and were buried there. And it also speaks to the whole globe, the whole planet Earth, because the president ends the speech by saying that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That is, if we all work for self-government, free government. It was a reminder that it's an ongoing battle to create and keep a democracy, as Benjamin Franklin is known to have uttered in 1787. Here is your document, the Constitution. Let's see if you can keep it. And Lincoln understood that. And so his brief remarks in Gettysburg are yet another reminder to everyone that men died fighting for those ideals, and we cannot forget their work, their contribution, their sacrifice. And that's why we all keep fighting and working for democratic and free government.
You know, you mentioned, first of all, if people want to still come to the museum to see the copy, how long will it be on display?
Yeah, the museum's copy here will be on display through Thanksgiving weekend, all through that weekend, 1st of December, in other words. We've had it out since the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg itself, back in July of this year, 2013. And this 5-month period that it has been on view will be its last public display for some time. We hope to keep this document in the fine shape that it came to us in, preserved by Edward Everett's notebook in 1944, and that a lot of careful people have taken a lot of care to put in the right place, in the right conditions, to keep it from fading, because it's a living, breathing document. Ink fades over time, paper slowly disintegrates over time, and the conditions of temperature and humidity do affect that. So we want it to last for as many generations into the future as we can manage here in Springfield, so that everyone is inspired by the president's words.
You know, you talked about how people came. I think people have come to see this from around the world. You mentioned off camera that you've had some film crews coming from different nations. Mm-hmm. What is it that, why are they interested? I mean, I think a lot of Americans understand this is American history. Yeah. But they might be surprised to hear that people from other nations are also interested in the Gettysburg Address.
It is a little surprising, but we have to remember that the American Civil War was the most horrific contest in the Western world, anyway, between the English Civil Wars of the 1640s and World War I in the 1910s. In terms of the number of people fighting, in terms of the number of people killed and the percentage of the population killed, it had the attention of the whole world at the time, and Abraham Lincoln has captured the imaginations and the principles of hundreds of millions and probably billions of people today. He is of very rapidly growing popularity in China and in India and in Brazil, which is a country we get a lot of visitors from. We did have a film crew from the largest TV network in Brazil here earlier this year. We had a film crew from the BBC in England. And these people are aware of Lincoln's global status. He's always been popular in Japan as someone who westernized, who modernized his country, which is an ethic of the Japanese people since the 1860s. And so it is the combination of his wonderful poetic and principled words and the man himself, I think, speaking for the nation in its low point, without question, that inspires people today everywhere.
Just before we close out, there's this myth, the story that Lincoln wrote it on the back of an envelope riding the train to Gettysburg. Do we have any real idea of how long did he take to, because it's such a remarkable speech, how long did he take to construct this? And it's so tight, you might say. I think it's 233 words or so.
It is 272 words.
72 words.
And that is about 1/50th as long as Edward Everett's speech that day, which Everett had memorized, whereas Lincoln read his from paper. He was thinking about it from the same week as the battle had been won in July. He gave a brief speech, an impromptu speech outside of the White House to commemorate, to thank soldiers who had defended the North from Robert E. Lee's invasion, and in some respects may have saved the nation in that week. And he was thinking about it. And they knew in Pennsylvania that they had a vast, horrific situation in terms of public health to deal with, to bury all the thousands of murdered, killed, dead soldiers and horses. And this required a national effort that was new during the Civil War, the idea of a national cemetery. And Lincoln was probably asked to come speak late in August or maybe early September for an event that would be held later on in the fall. And so he had at least a couple of months lead time to prepare something formal. But he didn't get Edward Everett's long principal speech until the very week before he went up to Gettysburg. And a good speaker doesn't want to repeat anything that the main speaker is saying before him or her. So Everett was kind enough to provide the president with his printed remarks, which were already available to him and would be sold as a pamphlet, so that Lincoln could boil down and not repeat either the theme or specific thoughts that Everett had uttered just before him. He couldn't compete with Everett as an orator, and he didn't want to compete with him. He couldn't either as a historian or as an angry Northern defender of the Union, because it was not the president's point that day to be angry. The president was invited to dedicate a cemetery to the thousands of fallen soldiers. So boiling it down to 272 words probably occupied a lot of his free thinking, his free time for a week, but that includes a couple of months at least beforehand.
All right, well, James Cornelius, we appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us about the Gettysburg Address.
All right, thank you, Terry.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.